And hi, Lane. Everyone else. Oh, wait.
Hello.
You're muted right now, Lane, if you want to say anything. Oh, there. Go ahead, Elaine. Oh, Matt, I can't hear in here. Matt's going to get us sound in the room because we don't have sound. Because we'll have time. What we'll do is just do some initial kind of introductory pieces and commentary. Let's see. And then we'll have space for conversation. Okay, go, Elaine, try to talk now.
With my mouth full.
Oh, there we go.
I'm eating my dinner.
Hi, welcome, y'all. Great to see you. Christian, we are live now and we'll get started in just a minute. Christian went somewhere. I'm not sure where though. No, actually not. He doesn't. I would think that I'm maybe what I'll say is just way of introduction tonight. We were figuring that we would have more of a smaller group for us to have a discussion. So this is more like a kind of book discussion group, but also we'll do some setup of things and just again not assuming everyone's read the book. And then we know that there will be folks who will be engaging with us later online. And so welcome to those of you for whom that is true if you're listening later online. And then we'll also do part of this as probably, or either a conversation about it as a rebroadcast too. So glad. I'll turn it to you, Christian, just to say a few words and then we'll dive in.
Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. Hopefully, right? Well, welcome everybody. It's great to see all of you. Great to see everybody online and folks who will join us later on. So this is our third event, I believe, of the year so far in our Faith and series, Faith and Forums. We've typically gone between faith and justice and faith and humanities. There will be some other faith and forums coming in the spring, but tonight is definitely a faith and justice. This forum was born really, I think we were kind of already doing some work around particularly anti-Black racism. But once George Floyd and the uprising happened, that intensified. And so we wanted to provide a space where people could wrestle with hard questions, typically reading or watching videos or things like that. So with the idea that communities of faith need to be attentive to issues of justice, because justice is at the center in some ways of the Christian calling, the calling of the Christian life. And to be a good human is to be concerned also with justice. And I think, at least the way that I would typically define it, justice is making sure that everyone has access to a flourishing life. So I think that's an important thing to note. So tonight we are going to be reading Caitlin Curtis's book, Native: Identity, Belonging. I guess we're not reading it, we're discussing it. Yeah. It is actually not too tough of a read. You can kind of make through because it's so autobiographical, but the title is Native: Identity, Belonging, and Rediscovering God. So with that, I'll turn it over to you for our next bit.
Great. So, and some of you may know this already, but part of why we chose this book is this month is Native American Heritage Month, and thought this would be a new conversation that we, at least collectively, had not had. So thought we would engage with this text. And I think the additional thing I would say too that comes up even in this book directly and indirectly is the idea of justice as being a part of God's shalom, and the way that we can live into that together, and also what becomes the impediment at times. And so As we get started, I wanted to start with from Joy Harjo, who is our current U.S. Poet Laureate, who has a poem that's called Eagle Poem that I think it's a prayer. So I would invite you to just close your eyes and you as we begin inviting God, who is already in our midst, to be within us and just breathing and opening us. So let's pray and contemplate this together. This is Eagle Poem Prayer. To pray, you open your whole self to sky, to earth, to moon, to sun, to the one whole voice that is you. And know there is more that you can't see, can't hear, can't know, except in moments steadily growing and in languages that aren't always sound, but circles of motion. Like eagle that Sunday morning over Salt River, circled in blue sky, in wind, swept our hearts clean with sacred wings. We see you, see ourselves, and know that we must take the utmost care and kindness in all things. Breathe in, knowing we were made of all this, and breathe, knowing we are truly blessed because we were born and die soon within a true circle of motion, like eagle rounding out the morning inside us. We pray that it will be done in beauty. In beauty. Indeed, God, might we be opened in new ways this night to you and to your love and to your work in this world as we come together to listen and to be transformed by your Spirit. In your name, amen. Well, I'm going to give you back the mic.
Okay. So we kind of talked through what we wanted to sort of chat a little bit about, and I'm just going to give a very brief sense or overview. How many of you had a chance to read it? Got a chance to read a little bit? Not yet. Not yet. We have copies also online. Carol had a chance.
Yep.
Elaine, did you? Go ahead, Carol. Okay. All right. Well, good. Well, so I'm not going to go through an entire explanation at all. I just kind of want to give a general sensibility. The book is it's autobiography, but it's sort of it's not a typical autobiography. It's sort of spiritual memoir, wrestling with her story, and raising larger social and communal questions. And by community here, I mean both Christian community and her own indigenous identity as a Potawatomi woman. And I think it would be fair to say that, in a sense, kind of if I was trying to describe this text, she's a young woman. She's in her 30s, early 30s.
Americans are getting a stimulus this month, but you can get it only if you claim it.
Oh, someone's got to answer that phone. She certainly, as you find out as you go into the story, she has roots in Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Georgia, but particularly Oklahoma and New Mexico. Is born in a Native hospital, grows up on a reservation, has an identity as a Native person, but also at the same time, and I don't know that she really talks necessarily about her family per se, but she notes that she codes as white. So she passes as white, and she lives certainly part of her life, significant part of her growing up years, in Christian circles, and in particular Southern Baptist circles. And those circles, her native identity, her identity as a Potawatomi woman, in a sense, is unwelcome, I think, is sort of the best way to get at. And so part of this, I think, way of describing this is her trying then she's gone through her own process, through experiences she has in ministry and otherwise, of re-encountering that part of herself and then trying to see. I mean, I think it's kind of an open question. Can I integrate that part, which I love, with this other part, which is that kind of Christian identity, which, to be frank, is like, and here's where, like, I'll just explain my experience of reading this, because I told Sarah that this is the first book that we've read in our forum series where I just I didn't make a lot of comments in the margins. I like to underline. I mean, I have some here and there, but they're not as many. And I think part of it was just, I experienced it like just kind of a washing over you. Like, it's profoundly beautiful, but also deeply tragic and painful. And it certainly reminds me of other Native authors that I've read, where there's a deep sense of pain for their experience. But I think for me as well, as a minister, it left me with a lot of questions about the active harm that our faith and our faith institutions have inflicted on people. And so I kind of hear her trying to work through that. And it was quite powerful. And there certainly are moments of profound hope, but there's also open questions, I feel like, even by the end of the book, about, is she going to be able to stitch these realities together? So she sees herself as on a journey doing that. And so I think these three, identity, belonging, and rediscovering God, they all work really well for her in terms of what she's trying to do. So that just kind of my initial thoughts. I know you have some spaces and places and things that you wanted to maybe talk about, so I'll turn it over to you.
Can I make a comment? My take is a little different from yours in that her mother was European, and so when she moved away from her dad, this is my understanding of it, that part dropped away. And I didn't get from her that the Potawatomi part was degraded or even pushed aside. It just wasn't there. She didn't own it. It wasn't there. And she jumped in with 2 feet into that that very I don't want to say narrow, although it is narrow, but this small, very tight knit Southern Baptist, and she jumped into it and really fully embraced it. And it was, I mean, she doesn't turn her back on it. I mean, there were a lot of good things about it for her. But then she realized there's this whole other part of her. And I'm just sharing kind of how I read it, just the shock of that, and now her deep, deep desire to pass this on to her kids. And then her call, I felt like the way I would have described the book is it's a call to action. That's what I got it from. That's what I got from it. This is a call to action. And so her deep desire, not only for her children, but for others, to get us in touch with what we ourselves have not discovered. I mean, so many of white, maybe I can't speak for everybody, but just we've not been introduced to it. So I think her call was introduce people to it. So I read it differently. So that was just interesting. No, introduce them to what's happened to the Native culture. Yeah. And then, of course, everything goes from there. But mainly, let it be known.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for sharing that. And I think I with what you were saying, I think she does really name that of when they left her, her parents get divorced and her dad really isn't a part of the picture for a lot of her life. And then she's in Missouri in this Southern Baptist community. And there's also like in her earlier childhood, there's so much poverty and experiences of that it's it's as she emerged into adulthood, which is totally normative developmentally, right, as well, is she starts to really wrestle more holistically with life and faith and where am I from. And I think one of the things that you named too is that sense of her primary writing is her own wrestling with belonging and where is home and where am I from. But one of the things she's naming is that I think also for so many people, and particularly for a lot of white people, that hasn't been part of the exploration of where are we from, like how does where we're from and the land and all these things shape us. And so yeah, and it's interesting. One of the things, I'm glad you named what you did too, because one of the things we talked about is we each had different experiences to reading, like different reactions and our own responses that we had to reading it. And just to honor and name that, like as any of us are reading texts, like there's totally different responses that can be happening where, and it's so much about what's going on within us and our own read and experience of the story. And I think you deeply were Christian, which I so appreciate you naming, in that space of that opening up of yourself to the grief that is part, absolutely, like there's so much pain and things she's processing through in her own journey towards healing. And I felt that as well. And this is also maybe my personality, is that like how I'll tend to be like, oh, we got into the good hard stuff. Now there's hope. Like, let's, like we brought up all the junk. Now there's a possibility that we could, recreate something. And not that that's not also true for you, but like that was a primary experience for me. And so wanting to like also name and honor that as we're readers of different things, that it will touch different parts of ourselves. And so, I think I wanted to just name a few, like kind of 3 to 5 different moments in the text, again, assuming not everyone's read it and some of us have, and then we'll open it up to, for those who have, your own sorts of, if there are moments in the text, things that you notice came up in you or questions. And then for those who haven't, just even hearing what you're hearing, if there's things that came up. I will say for me, I think this is one of the most beautiful books that I've read in a while. I also am predisposed to lyricism and poetry in writing, and this is like I love this kind of reading. And I thought she was incredibly honest and human and real, and also generous too. In reading her, and evocative in a lot of what she said. So a few different moments that I wanted to highlight. The one is actually where she really begins in a way. In her first chapter, Land and Water. And I think one of the connections she's making in that first chapter is so much, it's the space, as you see that if you go to the table of contents, she calls part 1 beginnings. And so the section on land and water is, I think, what she's surfacing a lot throughout the book is how a lot of Christian spirituality in the West has forgotten or kind of divorced itself from land and from water. Not that that's not a part of the Christian tradition, because it absolutely is. And when we read particularly the Jewish texts, right? Like, everything's, you go to Bethel, you build the altar to remember God met me on this land in this place, but that hasn't been a big part of Western Christianity. And so in that chapter, she makes so much of the connections between our own bodies, the land itself, where are we from, how the land figures into spirituality, and then water as life, water as lifeblood. And one of the things that I loved from this chapter that she brings up as well is she ends it talking about baptism. And in our tradition, we don't have like a baptismal font that just hangs out all the time, but that's a big part of both in Catholicism, right? Where you have the water at the back as you come in and you're supposed to, touch the holy water, and it's remember your baptism. And also in a lot of Lutheran traditions, that is a big aspect too of remember your baptism, remember your baptism. And I think just this is a thread that will goes throughout her book, is that sense of what have we forgotten? What has been lost? And actually, like, there's profound reclamations by seeing from another lens, seeing from her own particular multiplicity of identities, that's helping her to open up to God and to faith and to herself and the world in a new way. And I think becomes an invitation for the church to say, remember what have we forgotten? So that's one of the moments that I would highlight. I'll highlight just a couple more and then take a pause. One that I wanted to go to is actually it's way far back. So it's about, let's go to this one. It's on page 109, The Pain of Church Spaces. So Christian says that was a fun chapter.
I think that's one of those places where subtext became text, because I would say that I felt, I still, I think would probably stand by my initial experience of that the negative, and it wasn't always directly at her, wasn't necessarily active harm, but for instance, the fact that her grandmothers never talked about what it meant to be an Indigenous woman, like, and that those had been in part, experiences of colonization. And so just the Christian entwinement with the state in those policies and experiences or whatever, but then it comes out really in the really on the surface in this chapter. So that's kind of what I meant by my comment.
So why I wanted to particularly highlight this is I think it connects to with the moment we're in the church and considering we're voting on the 5th of December about changing our name. And she talks about on page 109, like this is the highlighting I did there. I just was like the whole thing and put it on my Instagram story and was like, this is really important, and this is true not just for Native persons. Absolutely, I think that has been the case for many Native persons. But also, do we have a? There we go. Thank you. But for, I think, even as she says, for like the whole church, about what happens when she says, for any number of reasons, church spaces have become unsafe for so many people. And if we want to be honest about how that happened, we have to be honest about the origins of the colonizing white American church, which birthed out of a European ways of knowing God and which still uses empire to get what it wants. So she names about the doctrine of discovery and the legacies of that, like the and so down in on the last paragraph, and she's talked about how she has had to look at herself and how she's embedded in that, how she's participated in that, and to say, she goes, if this church wants to be a safe space for anyone, it must begin with care for the vulnerable. And if the church cannot be honest about the way it treats its most vulnerable, colonization will only continue to manifest itself within and outside church walls. And so just like that whole question of when we say in this time, we want to be a church that cares about our neighbors, that's for the world. Andrew, actually, I think he said it the most eloquently I've ever heard him say it. And sorry if you listen to this, Andrew, then you're like, what did I say the rest of the time? It wasn't good. And that's not what I'm saying. It just really hit me today. We were meeting with Molly Marshall, who's the interim president right now at United. And Andrew said, you know, one of the things for a lot of Gen Z folks, which is behind our, you know, so it's some folks that you know who are your humans in your life, is that really there's a sense of that the institutions have, and that we all as the elder generations, millennial on up, have failed. At all, like they're like, there's a lot of like the climate's, you know, burning up, like, and the church is like interested in who it should hate and these sorts of things. And so he talked about how the work they're trying to do in emerging generations is to start the conversation with things that the students care about, you know, around being a good human, or around caring for the earth, around caring about these sorts of things, and then build the space to say, hey, as a church, we care about this. Like the gospel isn't antithetical to these things. It's actually part of it, but it's earning that right to be heard and to that sense of being trusted. And I think, you know, in this chapter, she's naming like what happens when the church actually has become a profoundly unsafe place for people, and how can we be intentional about actually rebuilding that trust and that connection. And so that's one of the moments, this is threaded throughout her, like throughout the book, is that sense of call to the church, that it's almost like I hear it as a loving, like, it's like, she's like, I'm part of it. She's like, I'm trying to do this work myself, because like she talks about the Still Christian conference she went to. She's like, I'm still Christian and I don't even totally know what to do with it, but I'm trying to figure this out. And so that thread comes through a lot. Maybe I'm going to just pause there. Others, either responses to kind of those two, or the different moments you've heard, or your own, whether you've read it or not, either responses to that or other responses, if you have questions. Yeah, here.
I was struck by the phrase, the church is in a safe place, because my train of thought goes that it's a really safe place because we don't deal with anything that's controversial. And yet, whenever something controversial comes up, we're totally divided. And so maybe being divided is getting us out of our safe place. But does that mean we go all one way or all the other way? Or how do we continue down a path that unites us as opposed to divides us? But it's a very safe place. There's no controversy. Happens to be one here, but by and large, there isn't a lot of controversy.
Yeah, I would just disagree with that, because you're speaking from, yes. Yeah, I can disagree with you. As a white male in a Christian, here, it may feel safe for you, but when I hear it's unsafe, I think about people that are maybe wanting to explore being here, who may come in here and not feel it's safe. So I think about others that we're trying to include, who might see this as not an inclusive space for whatever reason, even though we're trying to make it as such. So that's where I see the unsafe piece. People maybe of different gender identities, people of different ethnicities, as much as we're welcoming, it still can feel unsafe when you don't see a lot of people like yourself. So that's why, for me, I see that being a true statement, and not just this church. I'm talking about Christian, that church. Yeah. In general, especially like in Minnesota suburbs.
I would just say I agree as far as her description of the church, just in general. So I mean, I kind of resonated with what you said, and her her criticisms of the church, and it's sad. I mean, so it is a grief. It's painful to read it and to hear it and to know that that's true when you don't want it to be true. And then, so it's kind of like when you're in an area with a lot of poverty and you think, what can I do? I mean, you feel kind of helpless because you should do something, and yet it's so huge you can't. And that's kind of how this feels to me a little bit, that the issues are so huge in a way to really become the inclusive, welcoming place we want to be. I mean, anyway.
So two things, when it comes to, if anyone is on Zoom, can you holler? Yeah, if they want to, I want to make sure. The one thing okay. I'm just going to say a sentence and then we'll go to Elaine. Because I think part of what you're naming, which is Eldon, I think, which is part of her experience, is the homogenizing effect, or like when it's like, when we're all the same, or we like, or at least we show up to church pretending we are, which we all kind of know, like people talk about churches like, yeah, I don't show up and say some of the hard things, or like, then I can belong. And that's one of her questions, is what gets sacrificed in, so, there's belonging, but then there's really being able to belong and know that I'm seen as who I am. And so that sense of, on one hand, church has been conflict free, or like, it's like, hey, it's all good. But if you don't fit that, or if you've dared to question, or, whatever, you have a different identity, then where is the space for me to be that, be able to be my full self, and how that then becomes like profoundly unsafe. And increasingly folks I think most generations, not everyone, but like, there's a lot of people who are like, I'm not willing to do that anymore. I'm not willing to go to church and pretend or be part of something where we're just yelling out hateful things. Like, there's whole worlds where I don't have to live that way. And why would I go to church then? So let's go to Elaine.
The whole issue that Elgin started and Danielle responded to is, it isn't safe in our church to disagree and discuss different viewpoints in an open and respectful way. We send letters to the pastors, individually, and say what we think, or we avoid it, or we leave the church, or whatever. But we don't know, really. We are so conflict avoidant in this culture in particular, that we don't know how to discuss robustly different views in love and respect and constructively. And that's not safe. It's not safe if you can't do that.
Thanks for sharing. Thank you. Yeah. Others' responses to either one of those kind of two moments of the sense of church and safety, and why, from her seat, the necessity and importance of doing the kind of decolonizing and really being re-encountered, or anything about land or something else.
This is a quote from her book. It's in the same chapter, The Pain of Church Spaces. It's on page 105. Some things that stuck out. She said, the real question is, who gains life when we deconstruct these systems of whiteness, white supremacy, and toxic patriarchy? Everyone. And that's what I would just from right now, what Elaine is saying, I think we all benefit. I feel like all of us have benefited from the exploration that our church has done for a couple of years with name change and whatnot, even though some of it has felt difficult, frightening's too scary is probably a better word. I feel like we're all it is stretching all of us in ways that are very healthy. And then she says, I just think this is so good. The question is, how much do we want to see? Because once we see, we cannot unsee. Once we know, we cannot unknow. And I'll just share for myself, some years ago, I was just going through a time of saying, Lord, lead me deeper. And I was introduced without without searching for it into human trafficking. And I got involved with organizations and it was like, oh my gosh, I wish I had never walked into that room where the film was being shown, because now I know, and now I can't not do anything. And so that took me for about 5 years. And then I got introduced to another cause. And I was like, I don't want to know it. I don't want to know it. But I was plunged into it. And I had prayed the prayer, Lord, help my heart to break for the things that break your heart. And I thought, I take it back. I take it back. I don't want it anymore. I cannot take this grief and this pain. For a number of years, I just carried this grief that I thought, this isn't healthy. I'm all done. I'm done. But I felt, and then I felt as a church we did, and I thank both of you for this, really did a good job educating us regarding racism in a way that was, it took me up a few steps in a really healthy way, but I grieved. I spent a lot of time grieving there. And I honestly felt this book was another step to another thing that the Lord is showing me in an answer to that prayer. What I liked so much. So I when she said that, it was like, once you see, you can't unsee. You can't pretend you don't know anymore, But I thought I felt like she did such a good job of talking to us as a church and even giving ideas to us of how we can go forward. And I just have to share this because it was interesting, because I take care of grandchildren, and I picked up the 4-year-old from preschool today, and we were driving home, and she said, oh, these trees are so beautiful. I said, yeah. I said, you know what's interesting, Ruthie? I said, right in this land, right? I used her book. I said, right in this land, other people lived here before you lived here and before I lived here. And she's before, she names all these people who are old, before them. I said, yeah. And I said, they're called Native Americans. She's, I don't think I know them. I said, I don't think you know them either. And she said, well, who are they? I mean, we had this such interesting discussion. I said, well, you know how, some Black people, some brown people, some Chinese, we talked about it. And I said, they're called Native Americans, and they lived here before anybody else. She said, they didn't even have my house. I said, nope, not your house, So I just felt a little empowered. So it was really helpful.
Thank you so much for sharing that, and very moved. So thanks. I want to go back to the page you referenced and about how once you see, you can't unsee, and once you know, you can't unknow. And not only is that true experientially, but like when you read the Gospels, that's like what it's, right? There's like the encounter with Jesus, and you can't go back. Like that's so, the invitation of faith. And so this is where, and Elaine had to hear me say this earlier today about how, and some of you've heard me say this, like, I believe in resurrection more now than I used to. And that's because I've done it's for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is because of all the work I've done in therapy and facing all of the terror about like, what would I, like actually confronting my relationship with my mom, actually, what do I do with my own grief and pain around my family system? Like, can I face my own shame and stuff that I internalized as a kid? And through like going into those places, there's been more healing. And it's been hard. It's not like it was like, oh, and that was joyful and easy. It's like, it's just like our spiritual lives where it's, and it's part of it, I think, actually, where it's like a journey of continued transformation. And so she names here, though, after that part you said, the white church is afraid. She goes, but oh, the liberation that waits on the other side of knowing. Oh, the wholeness, the togetherness that comes with healing. That is the power of decolonizing, because she's saying it's actually like it's robbing humanity from all of us, right? And then she says that this is the grace that comes with seeing. And then I'm going to skip to the last, maybe to say it's actually, I'll keep reading, because then otherwise it's like I skipped the hard one. This is why the anger of Indigenous people, Black people, and other people of color is so important. It's why the anger of women is so important, because it teaches us about, she's saying it teaches us about how it disrupts and distorts the soul, the power, etc. She goes, but then something must change. And when it does, it will bring us all closer to our own humanity and the holy mystery of God, a closeness only birthed through the journey of pain. And like, when I read that, I'm like, this is literally the Easter narrative. Like, it's only by going through the betrayal that Jesus experiences, through like being killed by a Roman Empire that didn't want this to be happening, that then a new way of being human doesn't win. That way of trying to say we're going to stifle this, it doesn't win. And there is liberation and freedom and all these things. And so just that sense, thank you so much for sharing. And that was the other part that really hit me, is like, this is part of the journey and invitation. Like, let's be, let's follow. Others responses or thoughts with that? Or I guess I'm Carol. Oh yeah, Carol, unmute yourself. Sorry.
Okay.
Great.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Okay. This whole topic in this book was so attractive to me because I've read quite a few Native American authors, and I totally feel like I can relate to all of their feelings and their writings, their beautiful creation story, and of course, how they relate to the land and how we need to take care of it. I mean, that's my soul practically right there. But, and I don't know if many of you have read Robin Kimmerer, Braiding Sweetgrass. It is such a beautifully written, tender story about her experiences with the land, and then going on to white colleges and trying to connect her spirituality of being a Native American and going to a school where she needs to learn the botany and strictly adhere to the class, what the way they teach it. She couldn't understand why they wouldn't answer the question of why the purple asters are so beautiful with the goldenrod in the fall. And her professor said, if that's what you're going to think you're going to get out of these classes, you're in the wrong place. So she was trying to combine her Native experiences with university doctrine. And then reading this book, I mean, I really had a hard time. I almost wanted to put it down because I felt she was just going overboard on criticizing, almost bashing, and using the term she used to talk about the Christian community and how they treated Blacks and Indigenous people and all of our other groups. that it it was too much for her almost to handle. But I kept reading and finally felt a little better towards the end as she would come around and talk about how we needed to work together and do good for each other, which she talked about do good together quite a bit. So after I got all of her terms of this one sentence here, our communion tables come instead of body and blood, nationalism and homophobia, or white supremacy and indifference. I mean, she used some pretty strong terms talking about the Christian church in here. So that was kind of hard to read, which I think we've all mentioned previously. So I was very glad in the end that she talked more about coming together and working on this problem and welcoming people and certainly recognizing. I think the other thing that hasn't been mentioned, the displacement of the Native Americans, the Trail of Tears, and how they were relocated, and of course the government not following through on a lot of the promises was what we all know about, and that is definitely very unfortunate. So we all do need to work together better.
Thank you for sharing, and thank you, Matt. Thanks for sharing, Carol. And one of the things I just want to name that I really appreciate is that you continued to listen even as you noticed you were reacting and you were like, this is hard, I don't want to keep reading, but that you did. And I think that's really hard work to do when you're, in something and you're like, this is hard. I don't, and I just really respect that a lot and appreciate it. Because that's part of Christian and I were talking about this earlier, what's as a church and as Christians, what does it mean to actually for us to listen and to hear the stories and to sit with, and so I really appreciate you leaning in hard to do that, even as it was like, this is too much. I don't know what to do with this. And just honoring that conversational space, because it's so hard in our time right now, right? It's like, we're not particularly good as a people at doing that right now. And so just thanks for your vulnerability and sharing that too. So yeah.
One of the things that I've come back to is in one of the books we read, or maybe it wasn't for church, you end up reading so much, but something that struck me that has given me perseverance when I want to turn back or when I want to stop is and I don't remember the name of the white pastor who desired to start an interracial church in Chicago. And so he started working with maybe 8 other, and he was the only white. And so he was he spent a couple years gleaning from them their thoughts and how he could go forward. And it was after some racial incident, and so they were all talking about, how to move forward. And then, they had a couple hours together, and he said, I need to stop thinking about this and just let it stop. And he said there was just complete silence. And they said, that's your right privilege. You can go home and stop thinking about it. We can't, because these are our people. And we're going now to our churches where they're coming in weeping and wailing and travailing because of what happened. It was just one of those moments that for me, I thought, I can't turn back. I can't turn back. In order for me to walk with, I can't turn back. So, just thoughts.
No, I mean, this is slightly different. It connects to a little bit of what we've been talking about, but I think also one of the things that made it the experience that it was reading it was I don't know if any of you have been listening to that podcast about Mars Hill and just so I existed in an evangelical institution. I didn't really grow up evangelical, but I was teaching in an institution that's clearly evangelical, Bethel. And there's the whole Wild at Heart thing. We had a speaker come last month. And then this Mars Hill thing with Mark Driscoll, the same kind of toxic masculinity. Well, I think part of what I'm trying to get at is it was so interesting to hear someone who's wrestling with a question that is so huge, like the erasure of indigenous peoples, the dispossession of land, massacre, alongside of talking about Josh Diggers, or is that the guy's name? I can't remember. Is it Diggers? No, Joshua Harris. I apologize. I Kissed Dating Goodbye. So I've read. I mean, I knew about how horribly malforming that was for people, but to have it intersect then with her experience in ways that you never hear, it was such a category blowing kind of experience. So I just, that component of her journey and she having passed through purity culture basically and having to deal with that on top of this deeper question about her own identity as a Native Indigenous woman. I feel like there's so many layers there and things that need to be pulled out and disentangled, and but that was part of I feel like the complexity and the pain of it really is what I guess I'm trying to get at. The depth of pain, the amount of infliction of harm that has come out of Christian circles, whether we're talking about far right, far left, in the middle, wherever, it just compounded as I was reading through. And so if she makes a statement in here that she knows many Native people that will never set foot in a church ever again because of the pain, and she can't blame them. And I ended the book saying, if she left church, I would not blame her one bit. And then of course it raised the question but I'm a pastor and I believe in that church too. That's the kind of complicated things that I think it raises. And that's the level of sort of the difficulty of the experience of reading it. So.
Thank you for sharing. And I'm gonna do my own rift interpretation conversation back with you. So some of you know one of my favorite movies is called Chocolat. It's at some time in the 90s or 2000s. I don't know when it came out, but it was Johnny Depp and Juliette Binoche. And it's a story of this small town in which at the center of it is rules and orders about how things are supposed to go. And there's this parish at the center of the church. And basically everyone goes there, and it's a all white community, but everyone, they hide, they hide their story, they hide what's going on. And you find out that the minister actually, he's out back dancing to Elvis music. And but the town mayor is the one who's supposed to preserve everything. And so, he reads the sermons before they're preached. And then this woman comes into town who opens a chocolate shop during Lent when everyone's supposed to be fasting, right? And abstaining from chocolate. And so this town in many ways, I think, and what's going on embodies some of the real struggles that she's both naming and I think you're naming as well, around the legacies and the impacts of what happens when we've embodied a faith that actually kills and harms all of us, in the name of these like larger forces that have shaped all of us without even kind of recognizing how it's been at play. And what ends up happening through the process is everyone gets to become more human together, right? Everyone gets to become more human. But in so much of the church, we preach this gospel of freedom for all of us. And many of us have experienced moments or glimpses or parts or like profound experiences of that. But then we have these intersections where, and you're referring to like Mars Hill and Mark Driscoll, that was a church at which a man who was profoundly narcissistic, profoundly misogynistic, profoundly abusive to his entire congregation. And this podcast Christianity Today has put on to talk about and expose what really happened like at that church. And the podcast has been severely critiqued, which is why I haven't listened to it yet, because I know enough of the story that. So it was Mars Hill in Seattle. There was a Mars Hill at the same time with Rob Bell in Michigan, they were not connected. But part of what this surface is it's not a standalone case. We have a lot of churches in America where actually how it's set up is that you don't ask any questions, don't question the pastors. Like there's so much in the system that's actually harming a lot of people. And so on one hand, what she's surfacing is the particularities of her identities and histories and the particularities in which these forces, like in the chapter 7, she talks about a heart language and she names the legacies of the boarding schools. And she quotes the US government Army officer Richard Pratt, a great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one. In a sense, I agree with this sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. That's page 60. And so she's pointing out how in a misguided attempt to Christianize Native persons, it was like, we need to kill the Indian. And so I think this is part of what your name is, that there's the complexities around like how this has impacted Native communities, Native people in particular, but how these sorts of forces have impacted the whole of the church and the ways in which it's gotten corrupted by power or by, whatever the things that are operative that keep us all from being able to be human. And she's naming that too, and how that's that legacy. So you're learning to hate your body, learning to we need to subdue the earth. That's how we're Christian. And she's saying, no, we need to break all that down. Like, this is God's earth. Like, we need to care about that. God gave us bodies. We need to care about that. Like, God made different genders. We need, that's beautiful. Like, there are different races. That's wonderful. There's different cultures. But for too long, the church has been afraid of that and has been about controlling the narrative so that even the priests go out back and pretend that they, they're pretending that they don't like Elvis. That's my own kind of conversation back with you, but yeah, someone can go a different direction or respond to that, but it's so layered what she's trying to unpack.
Layer one little tiny thing. When I was reading it too, I thought about precisely the boarding schools and the fact that since this book was published, all the discoveries, particularly in Canada, and all of the hundreds of children buried. So that was the kind of pain.
Sarah, you were talking about working through it, and Janet, you were talking about, I know now I got to do something. And I guess what I don't know what working through it means unless we do something. And Christian, it seems we need to rewrite Christianity. We need to go back and straighten out Genesis because it leads us the wrong place. We need to straighten out Moses because they colonized the land that they went into. I mean, all of that is a foundational part of our belief is leading us to be abusive and non-Christian. And yet we tell those stories, Thanksgiving, we celebrate it as a church, and we're part of the problem. Our faith, our Christianity is part of the problem, and we need to get rid of it.
I just have to disagree. It's not, my look at it is, it's not Christianity that's the problem. It's the way, part of it is how we've been taught, and part of it is how individually we want it to be because it's uncomfortable in other ways. I think there's incredible value in unpacking the Old Testament. I don't personally think this is just me, as I have taken it as a study just because I'm interested in a lot of the oppression. I don't believe it sets us up for oppression. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. The way, well, this is a whole different thing, but the way, one of the things when I'm talking with, because I have people in my life that have a lot of questions, is that God's character does not change. So if God's character is one of absolute love, that's the same in the Old Testament as the New Testament. So what's happened, this isn't about the book, so I won't go there, but I think we missee some things because God doesn't change. So it's not like he was vengeful and then all of a sudden he became loving and he decided to send Christ. So, but on this book, she talks about 123. She says, approaching indigenous culture with the goal of getting Native people into the pews isn't the answer. It is merely an extension of colonization. Perhaps the church should consider that indigenous people have much more to teach the church than the church has to teach indigenous peoples. Perhaps that would change how the relationship works. The important aspect of this relationship is that it's a partnership. And she goes on to talk. But then on page 166, at least for me, that is such a critical piece. She said, what does it look like to return again and again to the voice of mystery in our lives? And then the last sentence in that paragraph is, to me, the crux of it. It always means asking, how can we become people who love better? And when I think about, because I ask myself a lot, I mean, with this, with black-white issues, any sort of racism, with the human trafficking, with persecuted Christians. Okay, I'm a 75-year-old white woman living in St. Louis Park, surrounded by a huge number of kids, grandkids, great-grandkids, a lot of complex mental illness in our family that takes 98% of my time. So what am I going to do? It brings incredible relief, I will say, to me to say, love better. At the end, what I do is love better. Love better the people that God's put in my life. Yeah, I can go help with the baby shower for the babies that are born to trafficked women. Okay, I feel this tiny little drop in the bucket. But that sentence from her, to me, summed it up. Yeah, because the whole thing is love better. So whether it's indigenous or Black or the rabbi who lives down the block, it's so wonderful. A rabbi and his 4 little girls down there, they come into our house. They invite us into their house. And I said, is it okay for your, I said, I'm so embarrassed to ask you this because they're Orthodox. I said, but it is okay. Is it okay if the kids come in? She says, well, we're making it okay. I said, great. Just love better. That brings me a lot of relief because I can get myself really entangled with what am I going to do? How can I do more? I need to pray more about this. And it's like, okay, settle down, Janet. Just love better the people that you're supposed to love. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Me?
Michelle? Yep.
So I agree with my dad, which is why I think a lot of people are leaving the church, because I think as white people, if we are looking at the Bible through the patriarchal and capitalist ways of looking at it, and then we are opened our eyes to something that is so broken and we say, wait, this doesn't match, then I think that's what we do is we walk away because it seems like the Bible must be broken or the faith must be broken. And so then I agree with Janet because the fact that people of color and people who have been oppressed and people who have had the land stolen from them and people who have not benefited from the patriarchal capitalistic society still love Jesus and still want to be part of the faith means that that's what we need to do is we need to listen to them. They're seeing something in the Bible that we are unable to see without them. And that's, I think, part of what she was trying to say is that we really need them in order to see this God who is able to love better. And Carol brought up Robin Kimmerer's book, and she is not a person of faith. And yet throughout the whole book, I'm like, she's preaching the gospel. She is telling how new life happened. She's telling how gratefulness, is part of how we were created. And so you can kind of, when you start to listen to other voices, you can see like, oh, God's in there. He's not in some of our white churches. He's definitely in these other places. And that's where I want to be. That's who I want to listen to and follow to learn more.
Thanks for sharing, Michelle. Hi. No, thanks for that. And I think, and you're right, like there's a big movement on Twitter that started a few years ago of ex-evangelicals or empty the pews. And it was a response to the ways, there's a lot of folks who had been raised in the church saying these ways of being like, this doesn't work. Like we need to leave. We need to, like, this whole story it's harmful. And I want to honor that's absolutely the truth for people and honor that. And to also name, like, for me, because that question, why Christian, like why am not you, but why be Christian, right? Why Christian? Why? I think for me, one of the reasons I've stayed is because like that earliest sense as a kid that God was love, like, is meaning for me. Like, and this is, I think for me, like, there's that, like, and that experience of faith throughout my own life. Was fraught. It's been both and, but there's, like, I always believed God was love, even though that wasn't actually what I was being taught all the time, right? Like, but that was what actually captured me, was that sense of being loved. And one of the things I think I've wrestled with personally that kind of resonates with what you were naming, Michelle, is that sense of like, this is the waters I swim in. like I'm from the stream, and almost like, what does it mean to wrestle as a person who's been raised inside of Christianity, to take it like I'm part of it. Like it's in my own, like I'm a white woman, I'm also a Christian. And so how do I take up the responsibility to then say, okay, so how do I hold my own faith accountable? How do I hold my own church accountable? How do I hold myself accountable? Because I've caused harm. I've caused real harm in thinking I was doing the will of God. And I clearly grieve that. And not like I'm done causing harm. I'm quite sure. But what's also been a really joyous experience and incredibly healing in my own story, given my own woundedness too, has been to reapproach, and like you said, to listen and hear from other voices, but to also hear from my own. And like this summer for me, getting to preach through Galatians, because like I grew up in traditions where there was one dominant way to interpret the whole book of Galatians. And to actually go back to the book of Galatians and be like, oh my gosh, this whole book, this is about what's happening is they're having a cultural struggle at the center of the church, and it's about power. And it's basically like, does one identity matter less than another identity? And Paul is actually like super radical transformer, saying all of the delineations around identities where you think one identity matters more than another identity, the gospel completely disrupts that. And actually it's not circumcision or uncircumcision, or if you're male or female, slave or free. That stuff is all the problem, people. Follow the gospel of Jesus and get free together. And I'm reading it and I'm like, I love Paul. Like, and I was like, who even knew? But my whole life, Paul's been painful. And I was like, God, I believe in you and I believe your love, but like, what do I do with this stuff? And so like, I honor and respect that for some folks it's like, no, I just can't. And I think for me, I've said, no, like I want to take this up, because it's changed my life in beautiful ways. And because I need to take up responsibility to like, let's do this and take it up to what does it mean to be the church, and to actually say, no, I'm going to fight for our kids to be safe at church. I don't care who they are, what their identity is. I don't want a kid to leave this church saying that was a harmful place for me, or I was unsafe, so trying to take up those sorts of things, and then to keep listening and to keep growing and to keep saying, oh, I didn't see, help me to see more, help me to love more. And that is really radical, because we can think we know all the right things anyway, or like I've done all the things. And yet the number of people of color who will say in progressive spaces, like people think they're super woke, but they're still treating me like I'm not a person. Like I'm still not being treated and loved and seen as human. And so like, if we can do that inner work to keep becoming, we start showing up collectively differently. And anyway, so
what does she offer, like, as hope? No, you know what I mean? So I'm just curious how she kind of ends the book, if there's suggestions, or if there's if there is a call to action, like you spoke about, Janet, like if she had specific ideas or thoughts on what that looked like for people that are in a more, superior, or a white person like ourselves.
Well, what I got out of it was, she does have a part about how do we help our children, on empowering our children to tell the stories. I felt her call, I did not come away with it, not that it's probably not there, but I didn't take away with, okay, you should do 1, 2, 3, 4. I did not get that. What I did get from it is her call to us, to humility, to listen, to realize we don't have the answer, and the desperate need to listen to others' ways of looking at things, and we don't have to comment on it, basically, to allow them to be. And I just want to share this story because it doesn't really relate to this, but it relates to the idea that it impressed in me. My background is taking care of kids a lot, but professionally, psychiatric nursing. And I had a patient one time who was so angry and just vented and vented and vented and vented. And I just kept sitting and sitting and sitting and sitting. Finally, she looked at me. She says, "Why are you sitting here while I am so angry and yelling at you?" And I said, "Well, I just don't feel like I can leave you when you're this angry. And I'm just trying to hear you. I'm just trying to listen." And it was just a beautiful experience. And she looked at me and she said, "Nobody's ever listened to me." And I said, "Well, I can't stay all shift, but I can keep listening a few more minutes." Totally changed the course of her therapy. It was 100% turnaround in the therapeutic relationship and where we could go with her. And I mean, I didn't plan it out. It's not like I was planning this out, but I felt like she was saying, she uses the word humility and she uses the word listen, but she does give ideas of how we can take this knowledge of natives into particularly our children.
Elaine. Go ahead, Elaine.
That's a hard story to follow. That was so beautiful. But just on the topic of listening and to follow what Michelle was saying, we have so much to learn from the Black church, and in particular, their understanding of the Old Testament stories and how important they were to understanding God's love and care, like Moses leading the slaves out of Egypt. And so they've given us insight, or me and others, insights into how we might interpret the Old Testament stories and how life-giving they can be if we would listen to other groups and how they hear those stories.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And she does in part 4 and 5, these are the parts where she really, like, she makes some of that turn and agreed. Yeah. It's not like here's the, and not that you were asking for this, but she doesn't say like, here's the quick pill, that will fix everything. But, she starts in chapter 13, I think, with the section around the wake up calls and begins to kind of build the sense of like exactly what you said. What does it mean to listen? What does it mean for the church to actually to learn and to hear, and for us as individuals to do that opening up work, doing the work of decolonization. So to begin to actually be willing, can we look at what's been going on in our world and in our churches, and be honest about that, and also do the inner work around our own stories and our own returning, the places where our own humanity got left at the door, and to lean into that. That's some of the things. And you look like you have something really particular you want to.
I was gonna throw in. I think as I was reading the book, particularly as I was getting into the second half, I realized, like, I mean, she's a poet, and this book really, Sarah used the language of lyrical, and I read tons and tons and tons and tons of nonfiction, and so it's outside of my typical thing that I read, and so it took me a little while to really kind of make my way into understanding, like, but she has these little summaries that she does at the end of sections. So she has 5 sections. And I thought the part 5 summary was actually particularly powerful. It's page 179. And I'll just read this. So what if all this, the whole journey, the beginning, the searching, the knowing, the working, the fruit that comes from the work, what if it is all the work of knowing and being known? What if at the beginning and at the end of everything, the only thing that matters is that we saw and we called it good, called each other good, called this kind earth good, and called the very nakedness that comes with knowing ourselves good? Maybe, just maybe, that's the whole point of beginning again. Maybe, just maybe, that's what the promise of a new world will always bring us. So I think it's sort of this inspirational, but also like sitting with, sitting with her story, sitting with the narrative. Yeah, I just found it to be quite a powerful experience of reading. And at times I was like, please tell me what to do. but that's not what she's trying to do in a sense, so the doing was actually the reading and hearing and sitting with and feeling the pain. Yeah, absolutely.
She says here on page 159, decolonization is not just for the oppressed, it's a gift for everyone. And that's what I felt like she was saying. I mean, you have to start with recognizing that there is a problem. And I feel like as a church, the leadership is doing a really good job of starting to say, you know what, we're going to start teaching about this because it hasn't generally been taught. So I think that's where we begin to realize, oh my gosh, there's a problem. And that's where I feel like this is the gift. Decolonization is for everyone.
What comes after the recognition?
Well, I mean, I even want to say, I think the hard part is that there are people who don't think there's a problem, even though we talk about the problem, even though the problem's out there. If you don't see it, if you choose not to see it, or for whatever reason, God puts blinders on your eyes, I don't know, but you don't hear it, see it. Seems to me the really, really hard part. I mean, anyway, I just think it's a lot of work.
It is a lot of work. I agree. What was your question?
What comes after the recognition of
I think well, I can only just say, are you talking about as a church of whole, as the whole? Let's ask Jeff. No, for real. I mean, my thought is, as that's how small committees, people who have a heart for something. I mean, I look at, the Young Life group, the Oasis for Youth group. I forget some of the others. I mean, so you get people who feel that tug. Okay, I now recognize the issues with the youth, and I want to international justice mission. Okay, now that I recognize what's going on with human trafficking, I'm going to start spending more time, giving my time to international justice mission, educating people about it. That's how I think we educate and then figure out, listen. For me personally, it's listening, because there's so many calls for so many things, but where do I put that energy? But the church is us. The church is these small groups. And okay, honestly, Elgin, I have no idea, but I mean, the way, there you go.
No, I mean, I obviously part of the experience of, for me at least, of reading this is it's the same kind of thing that you can, I think, experience when you're reading in anti-Black racism, when you're reading in gender violence, when you're reading LGBTQIA plus, where once you start to see the complexity and the breadth, even though it's still fuzzy and furry and you can't really make out the outlines, it can be paralyzing that you can have that kind of experience. So how do you break that? I mean, first of all, you keep going, right? You lean in, you don't allow the paralysis, which on some level is kind of, it's a human manifestation, but it's also a manifestation of a culture in which we can be paralyzed if we want, and by which I mean the white privilege part. But then, like, what are some small things? Like, if you're thinking about something like this, like, I'd say one small thing is we get involved with the Minnesota Council of Churches reparations project, reconciliation reparations project. I mean, they're engaging not only black churches around these issues, but also Native and Indigenous. That would be a practical step, but it wouldn't, as long as we don't approach it as if we're engineers. And I don't mean that in a negative way, because my dad was an engineer. I just mean, if we think we understand the problem and then we just come up with the solution, that will somehow, because human beings don't work that way, and history doesn't work that way, and cultures don't work that way. So if we take it as a first step in an ongoing process of learning, sitting with, et cetera, reading more, talking. I mean, one of the things I think that's so interesting in this book, which has started to come into a lot more in sort of anti-Black racism kinds of books that we're looking at, or racial capitalism, is like, it's not people of color's responsibility to educate white people. Like, we are supposed to educate ourselves. And of course, at the same time, you want to have that human connection. So my point is just that it's ongoing, but that would be an initial step, I suppose. Yeah.
I was just going to say, if there's ways for us to engage with people from different communities. So like there is the downtown congregations has a group, but like if there is something like that where you approached people from a mosque, people from, from a temple, people from the Native American culture, and even did something like this, maybe it's a quarterly basis, but you're like, hey, we're all going to read XYZ. And then your community, you get to choose what we're going to read, but you have people from different communities where you're actually having conversations together versus, oh, what are we going to do about this? Where you get to like hear from people and like meet them, hear their stories, and like start to have relationships with people outside of our own bubble, our own world. And I don't know if other churches or communities would be open to that, but I just feel like it could be a potential idea, some kind of offshoot of that, where you have the opportunity to mingle and be in a small group and turn to a neighbor and what was your take on something like that? Because we all kind of read about it, but we don't necessarily have a ton of first world experience all the time. And from a place of not like, we're going to serve you, we're going to go to like a homeless shelter, we're going to like meet you someplace, but just more as equals of reading the same thing or doing something, and they're sharing and we're learning from them, from different people.
I think we all know, if you know somebody, I mean, when you know somebody who's in a different culture, different whatever, that's when you change. I mean, you have that relationship. It makes all the difference. So that would help start that relationships.
I'm mindful that we're supposed to go to 8, right? Yeah. I'm mindful of the time and really appreciate everyone participating in that conversation. One of the reasons I think like we host this space and have wanted to be in it. For me, this is about our spiritual lives. Like this isn't a separate conversation. And even what you said, when you asked the question, Elgin, like, what happens when you know there's a problem? I mean, so much of the turn in faith and the transformation is when it's like something gets opened up and then you actually let yourself be opened and our hearts be changed and continue to do that work. You're naming the encounter, like all these sorts of things, and to use that, like that's part of our journey of faith, is to keep being opened up and transformed. And I could go back to that quote, the first duty of love is also to listen and to let like saturate in and say, Spirit, continue to open me. And then, these other things are really beautiful and important too. So I just really, I know it can be unsettling, but I can't tell you how much I appreciate your all's willingness to lean in and to like sit with and to listen to a person who you don't know personally, but a person who's naming her story and the story of a people who've been, there's a genocide of her people in our country, and yet a sense of, so then how do we let God open us to new ways of showing up in the world? And so I just really appreciate all of you taking the time to lean in, and I'll just close us in prayer as we go. Yeah.
We have used the Bible to commit atrocities. How can we use the Bible, the basic elements of the Bible, to overcome that? I mean, we've used all those passages and stuff just to do horrible things in the name of Christianity. And yet there's all that good stuff in the Bible. And how do we use that part? And I think it goes beyond us as individuals to us as a community of in the Christian faith.
Amen.
Okay. Thanks y'all. And thanks for being with us tonight. I'll speak the words, but let's pray together. God, we give you thanks that you continue to encounter us with your love in all the places of our lives. I pray that not just only those gathered here tonight, but that we as a community of faith, God, that your Spirit will continue to open us. The journey of being encountered by you through one another and through the other can feel terrifying and overwhelming. But God, we know that central to the message of life that you invite us to is that there is more life and more freedom if only we will but let the things that we think keep us safe fall away to actually discover renewed, reborn life. So God, by your Spirit, might you do that work and continue to do it in us gather, but in this place, in this church, in the church around the world, and in the church in our country. We are in need of your love and your Spirit and some hard love too. And so we give you thanks for Caitlin's work, her willingness to lean in and to share that leaning in with us. I pray that her family would be well, that she would be surrounded by a community who loves and supports her as she wrestles and shares. And God, might we be opened in new ways to hear from our Native siblings about both the power and beauty of their knowings, the pain and the truths of their experiences, that together we might all become more human and more loving, and that through this, your shalom and your goodness would become more here on earth than it is in this moment. So we give you thanks for this space and time to meet as we go forth. Go before us and with us. In your name, amen. next forthcoming Faith End will be in January, on January some date that will be the 28th says Christian, and I will hopefully be tending to a human, and I will see you later.
That's right. What will it be? Faith and
It's a Faith in Humanities. It's gonna be Sarah and